The door to the small cabin burst open with a force that rattled the single oil lamp hanging from the ceiling beam, and Mary Quinn spun around from the hearth so fast she nearly knocked the cast iron pot from its hook. Standing in the doorway, broad-shouldered and breathing hard, his silver star catching the last ember glow of a dying afternoon sun, was Marshal Jedediah Carson. His jaw was set like granite. His dark eyes swept the room with the practiced urgency of a man who had seen disasters before they announced themselves, and what he saw in that little cabin confirmed every fear that had driven him 6 miles at a gallop. "Pack the children," he said. His voice was low, but it carried the kind of authority that made the air itself go still. "Come with me. You are not staying in that cabin tonight." Mary stared at him. Her hands were still wrapped in the dish cloth she had been using to pull the pot's handle, and she gripped it tighter without realizing it. Her heart had already begun the terrible, fast drumming that she recognized as the body's oldest warning signal. "Marshal Carson," she said carefully, "what has happened?" He crossed the threshold in 2 strides and lowered his voice, but the urgency did not leave his eyes. "There is no time for the full explanation right now. Where are the children? Thomas is out back drawing water. Lily is in the loft." She set the dish cloth down on the table. "You are frightening me." "Good," he said plainly. "You should be frightened. I am going to step out and call Thomas in. You go up and get Lily. Take only what the children need for the night and what you cannot afford to lose. Move quickly, Mary." It was the first time he had ever used her given name. They had spoken a dozen times since he had ridden into Caldwell Creek 3 months ago as the new territorial marshal assigned to bring law to a county that had survived too long on its own rough justice. He had always been formal. He had always been respectful. But standing in her doorway with the controlled terror of a man who knew precisely what threat he was trying to outrun, he had called her Mary. And that single word told her that the situation had crossed past professional and into something that reached his chest. She was already moving toward the ladder to the loft. To understand how Mary Quinn came to be standing in that cabin in the first place, with a lawman she barely knew ordering her out of the only shelter she had in the world, you would have to go back 4 months. To the morning she stepped off the stage in Caldwell Creek, Kansas, with 2 children clinging to her skirts and a carpetbag containing everything she owned in the world. The year was 1878, and the Kansas frontier was still very much a place where a widow with no family and no money could vanish as completely as water into dry earth. Mary had been 28 that autumn, a woman forged by hardship without ever becoming hard. She had wide brown eyes that caught light in a way that made strangers think she was about to say something profound, and dark copper-brown hair she kept pinned severely back, because she had learned early that beauty drew the wrong kind of attention when you were alone. She was not delicate, not in the way that word is sometimes used as a compliment. She was 5 feet 4 inches of determined endurance, a woman who had buried a husband, kept her children fed through a drought, and taught herself to read contracts so that no man could ever deceive her with paperwork again. Thomas was 7 years old, her firstborn, a serious, dark-haired boy who had taken on a gravity far too old for his years since his father's death. Lily was 4, round-cheeked and sunny in the way that small children sometimes are when they have not yet fully registered the weight of the world around them. Mary loved them both with a ferocity that sometimes frightened her, because love that strong felt like the most dangerous thing a person could carry. Her husband, Robert Quinn, had died in the spring of 1877, not dramatically, not in any of the ways the frontier made famous. He had died of a fever that swept through their homestead near Wichita, quiet and sudden, leaving Mary with 2 children, a mortgage on a piece of land that had not yet produced enough to cover its own costs, and debts she had not known existed until the men came to collect them. She had sold the land, paid what she could, and used the small remainder to answer a newspaper advertisement she had seen pinned to the wall of a dry goods store. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Gerald Forsyth, a cattleman in Caldwell Creek who was looking for a housekeeper and cook for his ranch, with a modest wage and a small cabin on the property provided as residence. She had written him a letter that same afternoon, composed it carefully, presenting herself as capable and hardworking, which she was, and willing, which she also was, and arrived in Caldwell Creek 6 weeks later to discover that Gerald Forsyth was not precisely the decent employer his letter had implied. He was a man in his 50s with a prosperous ranch, a reputation that divided the town directly in half, and a way of looking at Mary that made her feel like something he had purchased rather than employed. He had been polite enough in the first weeks, and the cabin was modest but serviceable, and she had focused on the work because the work was something she knew how to do. But as the autumn deepened, Forsyth's visits to the cabin had grown more frequent, and his remarks had grown less careful, and Mary had begun to understand that the position had never been entirely what it appeared on paper. She had said nothing yet. She had nowhere to go. It was in October that Jedediah Carson had arrived in Caldwell Creek, riding a tall bay horse with the easy posture of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle. He was 33, lean and weathered in the way of men who worked outdoors, with dark hair going gray at the temples earlier than was usual, and eyes the color of deep river water, a blue so dark it was nearly black. He wore the silver marshal's star on his coat and carried himself with the particular kind of quiet that Mary had always associated with people who had no need to announce themselves, because their presence already said everything that needed to be said. He had established his office in the small building next to the land registry, which was the closest thing Caldwell Creek had to a courthouse, and he had spent his first week simply listening. Listening to complaints, to rumors, to the careful stories people told, and the louder ones they did not tell. He was methodical and he was patient, and the town had watched him with the cautious optimism of a community that had been burned before by men who wore stars. Mary had met him formally on the 3rd day of his arrival, when she had gone into town to collect supplies from the mercantile. He had been speaking with Mr. Aldridge, the storekeeper, when she came in, and he had held the door for her with a brief nod of acknowledgement that was entirely without agenda. She had noticed him the way you notice a landmark, something that fixes your position relative to everything else around it. Their paths crossed twice more that first week, each time briefly, and in the way that small-town encounters happen, at the post office, outside the church on Sunday morning. He was unfailingly polite. He was also clearly paying attention to the broader landscape of the town in a way that reminded Mary of how she herself observed rooms, mapping exits and intentions before she committed herself to a course of action. It was the 2nd week of October when everything shifted. Mary had been in town to collect a bolt of cloth that Forsyth had ordered for new curtains at the ranch house. She had the children with her, as she almost always did because she had no one to leave them with, and Thomas was holding Lily's hand with the careful authority of a small boy who had appointed himself his sister's guardian. They were standing outside the dry goods store when 2 of Forsyth's ranch hands came out of the saloon across the street, loud and careless in the way of men who have had 2 whiskeys too many in the late afternoon. One of them had called across to Mary, something she had no intention of repeating even in memory, and the other had laughed the laugh that men use when they know they are being watched and want to perform cruelty for an audience. Thomas had gone rigid at her side. Lily had pressed closer. Marshal Carson had appeared from the direction of his office, moving with no apparent hurry but arriving with the speed of a man who understood geometry, and he had placed himself between Mary and the 2 ranch hands without any particular drama. He had not drawn his firearm. He had not raised his voice. He had simply spoken to the men with a directness that communicated in absolute terms what the consequences of continuing would be. And the men had moved along with the specific kind of sullenness that belongs to bullies who have been stopped before they could complete the satisfaction of their behavior. He had turned back to Mary and the children without making the encounter into a spectacle. He had asked quietly if she was all right. She had said yes, and meant something closer to "I am always all right because I have no other option." He had looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes, and she had the strange sensation of being truly seen for the first time in a very long while. "Those men work for Gerald Forsyth," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He had nodded slowly, the way a man nods when a piece of information confirms something he was already piecing together. He had crouched down to Thomas's level, which surprised her, and said with complete seriousness, "You are doing a fine job looking after your sister." Thomas had stood a little straighter and said, "Thank you, sir," with the gravity of a soldier receiving a commendation. After that, something changed in how Jedediah Carson navigated his awareness of Mary Quinn and her children. It was nothing overt, nothing that could be called attentiveness in any way that overstepped or implied obligation. But she noticed that when she was in town, the marshal was visible, not hovering, not watchful in a way that felt like surveillance. Simply present, the way a good tree is present on the edge of a clearing, providing shade without demanding gratitude. She noticed, too, that he was investigating Gerald Forsyth. This she learned from Clara Whitmore, the postmaster's wife, who was the kind of woman who gathered information the way other people gather wildflowers, abundantly and without much regard for whether all of it was useful. Clara told her in November, with the particular urgency of someone delivering news they believe is genuinely important, that the marshal had been asking questions about Forsyth's land purchases over the past 2 years. There had been disputes, Clara said. 3 homesteaders who had sold their properties to Forsyth under circumstances that the previous county sheriff, who had since retired to Missouri with no forwarding address, had ruled satisfactory. Only they were not satisfactory. One of the homesteaders, a widower named Hank Mercer, had told anyone who would listen that Forsyth had sent men to his property to threaten him before he agreed to sell. But Hank Mercer had then moved away, and the only record of the transaction was the deed of sale with his signature on it, and Forsyth had papers for everything. The other 2 homesteaders had also moved away. Nobody in Caldwell Creek seemed to know precisely where they had gone. Mary had absorbed this information with the careful stillness she used for receiving bad news, and then she had gone home to her cabin, which sat on Forsyth's land, which she was dependent upon for shelter, and she had understood her position with a clarity that was not comfortable. Through November, the pressure from Forsyth himself had increased. He had come to the cabin one evening under the pretext of checking on a broken fence post near the property, and he had lingered in her doorway with the particular ease of a man who considered himself entitled to the spaces he entered. He had said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that he had been thinking about the arrangement between them and believed it might be structured more advantageously for both parties if they were to come to a closer understanding. Mary had looked at him steadily and said that she believed the current arrangement, as specified in their agreement, was quite clear enough, and that she would be grateful if he would send someone to fix the fence post in the daylight hours. He had left. But he had not left the way a man leaves when he has understood a refusal. He had left the way a man leaves when he is revising his approach. She had started keeping the cabin door barred at night after that. It was the 2nd week of December, 9 days before Christmas, when everything broke open. Jedediah Carson had ridden out to 3 properties in the county that had sold to Forsyth, and at one of them, a remote place 6 miles northeast of town, he had found something that changed the entire shape of what he was investigating. What he found was a man named Samuel Briggs, a homesteader who had not, as everyone believed, sold his property and moved away. Samuel Briggs was living in a half-dugout on the back corner of what had been his own land, surviving on almost nothing, afraid to come into town, because 2 of Forsyth's men had told him, explicitly, what would happen to him if he tried to pursue the matter of the forged signature on his deed of sale. The signature on Samuel Briggs's deed was not his. Jedediah Carson had spent the afternoon with Samuel Briggs, taking a deposition with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that this document might be the only thing standing between justice and the erasure of a crime. He had gotten back to town in the early evening and immediately gone to the telegraph office to send a message to the territorial judge in Dodge City. He had the evidence he needed to move against Forsyth on a fraud charge that would hold. What he had not fully anticipated was that Gerald Forsyth had his own sources of information in Caldwell Creek, and one of those sources had seen the marshal ride out in the direction of the Briggs property that morning. By the time Jedediah was composing his telegraph, Forsyth had already sent 2 men to handle the problem, and the problem, in Forsyth's estimation, was not only Samuel Briggs. The problem was also the woman in the cabin who had refused Forsyth's offer, and who he had now decided was a potential witness to any number of things she had observed in her months on his property. 2 birds, 1 solution. Forsyth's men were instructed to go to the Briggs dugout first, then to the cabin. Jedediah had found this out from a stable boy at the livery, a 15-year-old named Eli who had overheard 2 of Forsyth's hands talking before they rode out, and who had run to the marshal's office with the information, because Eli had also noticed that Marshal Carson was the first lawman in recent memory who was actually trying to do something useful with his authority. Jedediah had listened to Eli for 30 seconds, confirmed what he needed to confirm, and then moved. He had sent a deputy to ride out to the Briggs property with a direct order to stay with Samuel Briggs until morning and let no one onto the land. He had gotten back on his horse, which had barely cooled from the afternoon's ride, and he had pushed the bay hard across the 6 miles of frozen winter prairie between town and Forsyth's land, arriving at Mary Quinn's cabin as the last of the afternoon light was draining out of the sky, and throwing open her door with the force of a man who had made a calculation about time and urgency, and come down firmly on the side of speed over courtesy. "Pack the children," he said. "Come with me. You are not staying in that cabin tonight." Now Mary was climbing the ladder to the loft, her hands steady though her heart was not, and she was calling Lily's name in the calm, even voice she used specifically to prevent panic, and Lily came to her from the little straw mattress where she had been napping, still warm and sleep-soft, and Mary held her for exactly 1 second longer than strictly necessary before she began moving again. Thomas was already inside by the time she came back down the ladder, with Lily on her hip. He had heard the marshal's voice, and he had come in from the water pump at a run, and he was standing in the center of the room watching Jedediah Carson with wide, careful eyes that assessed and calculated in the manner of a 7-year-old who had been too old for 7 since he was 5. "Thomas," Mary said, "take your coat and Lily's coat from the hook. Go straight to the marshal's horse." Thomas looked at Jedediah. Something passed between the boy and the man in that look, a species of communication that surprised Mary because she had not known her son was capable of extending that kind of immediate trust to someone outside their small circle, but she would think about it later. Thomas nodded and went to the coat hooks. "What should I take?" Mary asked Jedediah quietly. "Documents. Anything that proves who you are or what you are owed, what you can carry in one hand." He was already at the window, not looking out of it in the curious way, but scanning it in the trained way, checking angles and distances. She went to the tin box she kept on the high shelf, the one that held her marriage certificate and Robert's death certificate, and her employment letter from Forsyth, and the small amount of cash money she had managed to save from her wages. She tucked it under her arm. She picked up her heavy wool shawl. She looked once at the cabin, at the small life she had assembled inside it from almost nothing, the clay dishes and the second-hand quilts and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and she did not let herself feel what she felt about leaving it because the children were already outside. Jedediah was beside her at the door. "I have 1 horse," he said. "I am going to put the children up in the saddle. You and I will walk beside. It is only a mile to the Henderson farm and they are safe people. You will stay there tonight. What about Forsyth's men? They are coming from the northeast. We are going west. His eyes met hers briefly. I will not let anything happen to you or your children, Mary. There it was again, her name in his voice, and this time she noticed that it did not sound like a professional reassurance. It sounded like a promise a man makes when he means it in his bones. They moved out into the cold December dusk, and the sky above the Kansas plains was the deep blue of approaching night with one bright star already visible in the west. And Mary walked beside the Marshal's bay horse with Thomas and Lily secured in the saddle and Jedediah's hand resting lightly on the bridle. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself the dangerous sensation of feeling protected. The Henderson farm was a quarter-mile further than Jedediah had suggested, and by the time they arrived Mary's fingers were numb inside her shawl. Joseph Henderson, who was 50 and built like a barn door and who had lived in this county for 20 years, opened his door to the Marshal's knock and took in the situation with the rapid comprehension of a man accustomed to frontier emergencies. His wife, Dorothy, appeared behind him immediately and pulled Mary and the children inside with the specific efficiency of a woman who had raised her own children in a time and place where danger was always a weather condition you checked for before you made plans. Dorothy sat Lily down by the stove with a piece of cornbread before the child had time to register she was cold. Thomas was given a blanket and a seat beside Lily, and he wrapped the blanket around both of them with the solemn protectiveness that Mary had learned to read as her son's way of expressing that he was afraid and was choosing courage instead. Jedediah spoke to Joseph Henderson in the front room while Dorothy set coffee on. Mary stood in the doorway between the two rooms and listened, not secretly but openly, because this concerned her life and her children, and she was done with the habit of being kept outside of decisions that affected her directly. Forsyth sent 2 men out tonight, Jedediah said. My deputy is at the Briggs property, which is their first stop. That should delay them. But I need to get word to the judge in Dodge City that we have a deposition, and I need to know that Mary and the children are somewhere safe while I do. They stay here as long as needed, Joseph said without hesitation. Dorothy will see to it. There is more, Jedediah continued. He paused, and Mary could see in his profile, the careful set of his jaw, that this next part cost him something. Forsyth is not going to stop at intimidation. He has covered crimes before, and he has done it with witnesses who disappeared. I need Mary to be willing to give her own deposition about what she observed in her time working at that ranch, the employment conditions, the men he sent to threaten her. He paused again. It is not a small thing to ask. Giving a deposition against a man like Forsyth in this county is not without risk. There was a silence. Mary stepped into the room. I will give the deposition, she said. Both men turned. Jedediah looked at her with an expression she could not entirely name, something that moved in his eyes that was more than professional respect and less than what she was not yet ready to call it. Mary, he said carefully, I want you to understand what that means. Forsyth has resources and connections. This case will go before a judge, but there will be time between now and then when you will be vulnerable. I understand what it means, she said. I also understand what it means to do nothing. And I have children who are going to grow up in this county, and I would like them to grow up in a county where Gerald Forsyth does not own everything and everyone in it. Jedediah was quiet for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved just barely, and it was not exactly a smile, but it was something in the same family. All right, he said. He rode back toward town after 10 o'clock that night, and Mary stood at the Hendersons' window and watched the lamp on his horse recede into the dark prairie and tried to understand what she was feeling. She had not felt it in a long time. She was not sure she was entitled to it, but it was there, warm and inconvenient and very much alive. The days that followed were not simple. They were, in fact, some of the most complicated of Mary Quinn's already complicated life. Forsyth's men had reached the Briggs property and found Jedediah's deputy there, and there had been a confrontation that had ended without gunfire, but with the deputy taking both men into custody on charges of criminal trespass. The men had been brought into Caldwell Creek and held in the small jail cell behind the marshal's office, and Forsyth himself had appeared the following morning with the town's only lawyer, a man named Carver who wore a fine coat and kept his loyalties where his payments came from. The territorial judge, a man named Harlan Briggs, no relation to Samuel, had received Jedediah's telegraph and responded within 2 days that he would be in Caldwell Creek before the end of the week. This was faster than anyone had expected, and it spoke to the seriousness with which the judge regarded a case involving forged land deeds, which were one of the most endemic crimes on the Kansas frontier, and one that the territorial government had made a stated priority. Mary had given her deposition on the second day at the Hendersons' farm, with Jedediah writing it out longhand at the kitchen table, while Dorothy kept the children occupied in the other room. Mary had spoken clearly and steadily, beginning with the nature of the employment as advertised compared to the reality she had found, progressing through the behavior of Forsyth's hands, and including a specific description of the evening visit in which Forsyth had implied that their arrangement might be restructured to something she had not agreed to and would not agree to. Jedediah had written everything down without interruption, or the kind of editorializing that some men do when they believe a woman's account requires their interpretation to be useful. He had simply written what she said. When she finished, he had read it back to her, asked her to confirm it was accurate, and asked if there was anything she wished to add or clarify. "That is everything," she said. He looked up from the paper. In the kitchen light at close range, he was very human, she thought. The lines at the corners of his eyes were the kind earned by years of squinting into distance. There was a small scar along his jaw, old and white, that she found herself wondering about. "You are very brave," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I am very tired of being afraid. It is not the same thing." He considered that. Maybe not, but the outcome is the same. They looked at each other across the kitchen table with the particular intensity of two people who have been carefully not looking at each other and have finally run out of reasons to maintain the effort. Mary was the one who looked away first, not because she wanted to, but because Dorothy chose that moment to come back in with a fresh pot of coffee and the comfortable noise of ordinary domestic life, and the moment dissolved. But it had been there. They had both felt it. And there is a kind of honesty that exists in the acknowledgement of a thing, even when you do not speak it aloud. Judge Briggs arrived on the Thursday, traveling by private coach with 2 federal deputies who were both larger than most of the furniture in the Caldwell Creek courthouse. The proceedings were not a full trial, that would come later, but they were sufficient for the judge to issue a warrant for Gerald Forsyth's arrest on charges of land fraud and coercion, with additional counts related to the intimidation of witnesses. Forsyth was arrested on the Thursday afternoon. He went quietly, which surprised some people and did not surprise others. Gerald Forsyth was a man who had built his power on the assumption that no one would ever succeed in organizing the evidence against him, and faced with the evidence organized, he defaulted to the stillness of a man reassessing his options. Lawyer Carver posted bail that same evening. The amount the judge set was high enough to communicate the seriousness of the charges, while remaining within the realm of what Forsyth could afford. Because a man unable to make bail does not present himself to trial, and Judge Briggs wanted Forsyth to present himself to trial. The conditions of the bail included an explicit prohibition against any contact with witnesses, which meant Mary Quinn and Samuel Briggs, and an explicit prohibition against leaving the county. Forsyth had returned to his ranch. His 2 arrested hands had also made bail. The town of Caldwell Creek had gone quiet with the specific tension of a place that is waiting to find out whether the law will hold. Mary had remained at the Hendersons' farm through the week, and Dorothy Henderson had managed this in the way that frontier women manage all things that need to be managed, by simply absorbing the situation into the daily routine and letting the work do what work does, which is to give people something purposeful to do with their hands while their minds process whatever they need to process. Thomas had taken to helping Joseph Henderson with the morning chores, and Joseph had received this help with the grave seriousness it deserved, which further confirmed in Thomas's estimation that Joseph Henderson was a person worth knowing. Lily had adopted Dorothy's old cat, an enormous gray animal named Mr. Buttons, as her personal sovereign, and Mr. Buttons had submitted to this arrangement with the inscrutable dignity of cats. Jedediah came to the Henderson farm every day. Ostensibly, he came to update Mary on the legal developments, which was legitimate and necessary. But Mary noticed that his visits stretched past what was strictly required for that purpose, and she noticed that Joseph and Dorothy had developed the habit of excusing themselves from the room at some point during each visit, with a naturalness that was just slightly too natural to be entirely accidental. On the Saturday of that week, with the judge still in town and the legal machinery running its heavy course, Jedediah arrived in the late afternoon and found Mary sitting on the Hendersons' porch in the winter sunlight, which was pale and thin but present, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee and her eyes on the long, flat horizon. He sat down in the other porch chair without asking, which told her something about how comfortable he had become in this space. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was the kind that is not uncomfortable, which itself says a great deal. "What will you do?" he said finally. "When this is over?" She thought about the question honestly. "I do not know. I cannot go back to the cabin. That was Forsyth's property, and I suspect the terms of my employment will not survive his arrest." "That is true," he said. "Clara Whitmore mentioned that the school needs help in the spring. I have some teaching experience. Before I married Robert, I worked for 2 years in a schoolhouse in Lawrence." She paused. "Thomas needs to be in school properly. He is reading above his age, and he is going to outgrow what I can teach him in the cabin before long." Jedediah nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands in a slow, absent way. "I have a house in town," he said. "Nothing grand. The 2 rooms above the land registry office. But it is warm and it is sound." She waited, not sure where this was going. "I'm not saying this correctly," he said, and something in his voice changed, became less controlled, more direct in the way of a man who has prepared a speech and then abandoned it in favor of the truth. He looked at her. "I am 33 years old, and I have spent the last 10 years being very efficient and very alone, and it occurred to me sometime in the past 3 weeks that I would very much like not to be alone. And that specifically, it is you that I am thinking about when I think about not being alone." Mary held his gaze. Her heart was doing the fast, warm thing it had been doing with increasing frequency in the vicinity of this man. "Marshal Carson," she said. "Jedediah," he said firmly. She almost smiled. "Jedediah, I have 2 children who are 7 and 4 years old. I'm a widow of less than 2 years. I have no property and no income at the moment, and I am currently in a precarious situation with respect to a land fraud case. I want to be certain that you understand what you are saying." "Mary," he said, and his voice had the same quality it had when he had told her he would not let anything happen to her or her children, something bedrock under it, something that did not apologize for itself. "I understand exactly what I am saying. I have thought about it thoroughly. I would not have said it if I had not." She looked at him for a long moment, and in the pale December sunlight with the Kansas plains stretching out to nothing behind him, she saw a man who was offering something real. Not convenience, not a solution to a practical problem. Something real, with all the weight and intention that word carries when it is used properly. "I think," she said carefully, "that you should give me some time to breathe first." "Of course," he said immediately. "But I also think," she continued, and she let herself look at him fully, let him see that she meant what she was saying, "that when I have breathed, I will be very glad you said what you said." Something shifted in his expression, Something opened that had been carefully contained, and it made him look younger and considerably more vulnerable. And she found that this version of Jedediah Carson affected her even more than the steady, controlled version she had been studying for 3 months. "That is enough for me," he said. The trial of Gerald Forsyth was set for March in the territorial court at Dodge City, which was the closest city with a courthouse suitable for the scope of the charges. In the meantime, Jedediah had arranged with the county for Mary to receive a temporary position as an assistant teacher at the Caldwell Creek schoolhouse, a position that came with a small wage that would cover her board at Mrs. Aldridge's rooming house, which was above the Mercantile and was clean and warm and run by a woman who had been educated in Ohio, and who had a strict policy against any nonsense of any kind in her establishment, which suited Mary perfectly. Thomas started school. It went exactly as Mary had predicted. Within 2 weeks his teacher, a young man named Mr. Dahlin, had sent Mary a note saying that Thomas was the most advanced student he had encountered in 4 years of teaching on the frontier, and could Mary please send him to school with something additional to occupy himself during the arithmetic lessons, because he was correcting the other children's work before they had finished it. Lily spent her mornings with Mary in the lower room of the schoolhouse, which had a corner set aside for the small children of staff while lessons ran, and Mr. Buttons had come with them from the Henderson farm when Dorothy insisted they take the cat because Lily cried for 2 minutes at the idea of leaving him, and Dorothy Henderson was not a woman who could withstand 2 minutes of Lily crying. So there was a cat in the schoolhouse. This was, by general agreement, an improvement. Jedediah's courtship of Mary, if that is what you could call it, was conducted with the same methodical thoroughness he brought to everything he did. It was also conducted with an awareness of her circumstances and her timeline that she found more affecting than any grand gesture could have been, because a grand gesture costs a moment but patience costs everything. He came to Mrs. Aldridge's on Sunday afternoons, which was the one time the schoolhouse was closed and Mary's hours were her own. He brought things. On the first Sunday, a book he had thought she might like based on something she had mentioned in conversation. On the second Sunday, a small carved wooden horse for Thomas, plain and smoothly finished, the work of someone who had made it rather than bought it. On the third Sunday, a piece of ribbon for Lily's hair, a deep burgundy that Lily immediately declared was the most beautiful color in the world, and Mary privately agreed. They walked when the weather permitted. Caldwell Creek was not a romantic landscape by any conventional measure. It was flat and cold, and the main street was mostly mud, but conversation does not require scenery. They talked about everything. Mary talked about her childhood in Missouri, about her father who had been a schoolteacher himself and had given her the reading habit that had served her better than any other inheritance. She talked about Robert, honestly, and without the kind of reverence that sometimes coats grief when people are not being truthful. Robert had been a decent man who had tried hard and died young, and she had loved him. But she had also, she told Jedediah, sometimes felt very alone in that marriage in ways she had never fully articulated to anyone. Jedediah talked about his own history with the same measured honesty. He had grown up in Missouri too, which surprised her until she calculated that there were probably more people from Missouri on the Kansas frontier than from any other state. He had been a deputy in 2 counties before taking the territorial marshal position, and before that he had worked cattle for 3 years, and before that he had fought in the tail end of the war on the Union side. 16 years old, and terrified and angry in equal measure. He had come back from the war with the specific kind of quietness that men bring back when they have seen things they will not describe, and have chosen order and law as their response to the experience of chaos. He had been engaged once in his mid-20s to a woman named Catherine who had waited 2 years for him and then, reasonably and without malice, married someone else when it became clear that Jedediah's work kept him from being present in the ways a marriage requires. He did not speak of it as a wound. He spoke of it as a lesson he had taken seriously, which was that presence is not a peripheral feature of love, It is the thing itself. Is that why you settled? Mary asked him once on one of their Sunday walks in January, when the cold was spectacular but the sky was a blue so vivid it seemed to be overcompensating. He thought about the question. Partly, he said. And partly because I was tired of moving, and partly because of you. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. Jedediah, she said, you had been in Caldwell Creek for 3 weeks when you helped me in front of the mercantile. Yes, he said. That was not because of me. That was because you are the kind of man who intervenes when he sees injustice. Both things can be true, he said quietly. He met her eyes. I intervened because of who I am. I thought about it for 2 weeks afterward because of who you are. She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the flat plains with the particular sound of a country that is entirely honest about what it is. No shelter, no softness, just the immensity of the sky and the earth and the distance. I am not an easy proposition, she said. I want you to know that I know that. 2 children, a complicated legal situation, very limited resources, strong opinions. Mary, he said, and she heard the patience in his voice and the warmth under the patience. I am a man who finds complicated things interesting. I am specifically not interested in easy propositions. She laughed. She had not laughed in a long time, and it surprised her, the way it came out of her fully and warm, and she saw the expression on Jedediah's face when she laughed, which was the expression of a man who has just decided something definitively. He took her hand. They were wearing gloves, both of them, because it was January in Kansas, and even through the wool she felt the warmth and the steadiness of his grip. They stood there in the cold sunlight holding hands for the first time, and it was, Mary thought, exactly as uncomplicated as it was supposed to be, and she had not expected simplicity to feel so much like relief. The Forsyth trial in March was not simple at all. Mary and Jedediah traveled to Dodge City by train, the railroad having reached that far by 1878, with Thomas and Lily, Samuel Briggs, and 2 of the Henderson men as additional witnesses. Mrs. Aldrich had closed the rooming house for the week and come along as well, which had not been strictly necessary, but which Dorothy Henderson had organized, because both women had independently arrived at the conclusion that Mary should not navigate a courtroom without female support. The courtroom in Dodge City was the most impressive room Thomas had ever been in, which he announced upon entering it, and which Jedediah had crouched down to hear, and then agreed with solemnly while straightening the boy's collar for him. The trial lasted 3 days. Gerald Forsyth's lawyer was better than Lawyer Carver. He was a man from Kansas City who wore a very fine suit and who specialized in the kind of legal reasoning that takes a clear thing and makes it complicated. He challenged the deposition. He challenged the chain of custody for the Briggs deed. He made arguments about the nature of evidence and the standards required for conviction that were technically sophisticated and practically aimed at exactly one thing, which was creating enough uncertainty in the jury's mind to produce an acquittal. Mary testified on the 2nd day. She sat in the witness chair and answered every question in the clear, steady voice she had used for the deposition. And when Forsyth's lawyer attempted to use implication to suggest that her account of his client's behavior was motivated by personal grievance, she said with perfect composure that her account was motivated by what had occurred, and that she had documented it at the time it occurred, and that she was willing to have any aspect of it examined under oath. Judge Harlan Briggs, who had a courtroom manner that suggested he had heard approximately everything and was not impressed by any of it, observed her testimony with the focused attention of a man sorting for relevance, and when she stepped down he said simply, "The witness's testimony is entered as recorded." The jury took 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on the fraud charges and 2 of the 3 coercion charges. The 3rd coercion charge, relating to the direct threat against Samuel Briggs, was reduced to a lesser offense on the grounds that the direct perpetrators were Forsyth's employees rather than Forsyth himself, a distinction that the lawyer had argued with some genuine legal force. Forsyth was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison. It was not everything. The 3 years of bad conduct, the displaced homesteaders, the bought sheriff, the vanished witnesses, none of that was fully prosecuted because the evidence had either disappeared with the people involved or predated the territorial statute under which the charges were brought. Mary had known this might be the outcome, and she had prepared herself for it. 5 years was not nothing. 5 years removed Gerald Forsyth from Caldwell Creek, and the land he had accumulated through fraud would be tied up in legal proceedings that would occupy Forsyth's lawyer for longer than the jail sentence. Samuel Briggs would get his land back. That was the thing that made the outcome feel like justice, the specific detail of a man who had been dispossessed getting the thing back that was his. On the evening after the verdict, in the modest hotel in Dodge City where the Caldwell Creek party was lodged, Jedediah found Mary sitting alone in the small courtyard at the back of the building. The children were asleep. The others had gone to the dining room. She was sitting on a wooden bench with her hands clasped in her lap and her eyes somewhere far away. He sat down beside her without speaking. After a moment she said, "I keep thinking about the homesteaders who moved away. The ones we do not know what happened to." "I know," he said. "This does not fix everything that was wrong." "No," he agreed, "but it fixes what we could reach from where we were standing." She looked at him. In the lamplight that came through the hotel's back window, he looked tired, the good tired of a man who has finished a piece of hard work, but there was something in his eyes that was watching her with a tenderness so unguarded that it made her breath catch. "Jedediah," she said. "Yes." "I have breathed," she said. He looked at her for a moment to be sure of what she meant. Then he said very quietly, "So have I." He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kind that happens between two people who have been circling a truth for long enough that, when they finally arrive at it, the truth feels less like something new and more like something they have always known. She kissed him back with everything she had been carefully not acknowledging for 4 months, and it felt, she thought, like the first warm day after a very long winter. They were married in May. The ceremony was in the Caldwell Creek Church, which was a plain building with good windows and a minister named Reverend Holt, who had married more frontier couples than he could count, and who had a gift for keeping services brief without sacrificing substance. Dorothy Henderson had made Mary a dress from a length of pale blue muslin that she had ordered from the mercantile in February, which told you something about when Dorothy had begun expecting this outcome. Thomas was Jedediah's best man, a role he took with the complete seriousness that he brought to everything, and which required him to hold 2 rings in his breast pocket for the duration of the service, and to hand them over at the correct moment, which he did with the precision of a small general executing a maneuver. Lily threw flower petals from a basket. She had been told to throw them in a measured fashion along the aisle. She interpreted this instruction as being about throwing, rather than being measured, and deposited approximately half of them in the first 2 feet of aisle, and then scattered the remainder in a wide arc across the front 2 pews, and Reverend Holt had to conceal a smile behind his Bible. Mr. Buttons attended, technically against the rules of the church, having been smuggled in the basket under the flower petals before Lily decided the petals needed to be thrown. He exited the basket at a crucial moment and sat on the altar step for the duration of the vows with the expression of a cat who has decided that this event was about him, which Lily later confirmed was correct. It was the happiest day of Mary Quinn's life to that point. She stood beside Jedediah Carson in the pale May sunlight that came through the church windows and said the words she meant completely, and she felt the warmth of his hand holding hers and the certainty of someone who has found the right thing after a long search and knows it in the body before the mind has fully caught up. He looked at her when the minister pronounced them married, and she would have the expression on his face for the rest of her life, she thought, stored away in the part of memory that keeps the most precious things in the best light. They moved into a house that month. Not the 2 rooms above the land registry, which had been suitable for a single man, but was not suitable for a family. The house was on the western edge of Caldwell Creek, a proper frame house with 3 bedrooms and a wide front porch, and a kitchen that had a real stove rather than a hearth hook. And it was more house than Mary had ever lived in, and she walked through it on the first morning with the slightly overwhelmed feeling of someone who has been planning for survival for so long that abundance requires adjustment. Thomas claimed his bedroom with great seriousness, arranging his books and the carved wooden horse on the windowsill in a precise configuration that he maintained for years afterward. Lily's room had a window that looked west, and she announced that she could see all the way to the end of the world from it, which in the flat Kansas landscape was not entirely untrue. Jedediah adjusted to being a family man with the same thoroughness he brought to every other aspect of his life. He learned, among other things, that Thomas required advance notice before changes in routine, that Lily required physical contact when upset rather than verbal reassurance, that Mary took her coffee strong and her opinions seriously, and that Mr. Button slept at the foot of whatever bed he chose and could not be relocated once he had made his selection. He was good with the children. Not in an effortful way, not in the way of a man who is performing goodness as an audience, but in the genuine, comfortable way of someone who finds the company of children interesting and takes their concerns seriously. He taught Thomas to play chess on a board he had bought in Dodge City. He read to Lily from the same McGuffey readers that were used at the school, letting her pick which stories she wanted heard, and he sat through her favorite 3 times in a row on a single evening without complaint, which cemented his status in her estimation as the best man in the world. The summer of 1879 was one of the better summers on the Kansas plains, with enough rain to keep the crops reasonable and enough sun to keep spirits up, and Caldwell Creek had settled into the particular steady rhythm of a town that was beginning to trust its institutions. Jedediah's work had changed the texture of the county in ways that were not visible in any single event but were present in aggregate, in the fact that disputes were brought to the marshal's office rather than handled privately, in the fact that the county's small farmers were less afraid, in the fact that when new settlers arrived and asked at the mercantile what kind of place this was, the answer they received was increasingly positive. There were still problems. There would always be problems. The frontier was not a solved equation, and never would be. There were difficult days and hard cases and nights when Jedediah came home later than he had meant to and Mary read by the lamp until she heard his horse and went to the kitchen to put coffee on. On those nights, they sat at the kitchen table and talked, sometimes about the day and sometimes about other things, and the conversations were the backbone of the marriage, the thing under everything else. In the autumn of 1879, Mary discovered she was expecting their first child together. She told Jedediah on a Saturday evening, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, with the lamp between them and the sound of the Kansas wind, making the house feel particularly solid and warm. She said it plainly because she was a woman who believed in saying things plainly, and she watched his face. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took both her hands in both of his, and when he looked at her, she saw in his expression something so full, so undefended, so completely without any of the guardedness that had characterized him in their early months, that she felt her own eyes fill. "Mary," he said, which was all he said for a moment because it was sufficient. "Are you pleased?" she asked, knowing the answer but wanting to hear it. "I am," he said, "the most pleased man in Kansas." He paused, possibly in the territory. She laughed, and he stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was entirely characteristic of him when no one was watching, and she leaned into him and felt the warmth of the kitchen and the solidity of the house and the particular safety of being held by someone who holds you because you are irreplaceable. Thomas received the news about the coming baby with the thoughtful gravity of a boy considering a complex logistical situation. He had questions about sleeping arrangements, about whether the baby would be loud, and about whether Mr. Buttons would need to be relocated, that last question being the one that clearly concerned him most on behalf of the cat. Lily received the news with immediate, unreserved joy, declaring that she wanted a sister named Rose, and that the sister named Rose would sleep in her room. Mary gently explained that they would see about the name, and Jedediah gently explained that they would see about the room arrangement, and Lily spent the following week referring to the baby as Rose in order to establish precedent. The baby was born in June of 1880 in the house in Caldwell Creek, attended by the doctor and by Dorothy Henderson, who had traveled in from the farm for the purpose. The labor was long and hard in the way of such things, and Jedediah paced the hall outside the bedroom with the controlled agitation of a man who is extremely comfortable with danger and is completely useless in the face of the kind of vulnerability that has no adversary he can act against. The baby was a boy. A solid, red-faced, vigorous boy who announced his arrival at considerable volume, and who, after he had been cleaned and wrapped, was placed in Jedediah's arms while Mary lay back against the pillows exhausted and satisfied. Jedediah stood perfectly still, holding the boy, and his face was the face of a man who is having a feeling too large to process quickly. "Henry," Mary said from the bed. He looked up at her. "I thought we might call him Henry," she said, "after your father." Jedediah's father, who had died when Jedediah was 20, had been named Henry. Mary had heard the name once in passing mentioned in one of their early conversations, and she had kept it in the part of her memory she used for things that mattered. He looked back down at the baby in his arms and his throat moved. "Henry," he said quietly, trying the name. "Henry Carson." "Unless you would prefer something else," she said. "No," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that was not his usual voice. "Henry is exactly right." Thomas accepted Henry with the conscientious protectiveness that characterized his approach to everyone he loved. He was 9 by then, and he had very specific opinions about the correct way to hold an infant, which he had researched by asking the doctor questions at length, and he shared these opinions freely. Lily, who had lobbied for a sister named Rose and been presented instead with a brother, took a single afternoon to process this outcome, and then declared that Henry was better anyway because she could teach him to ride. He was 6 months old when she said this. Jedediah found it entirely plausible. The years that followed were full. Full in the way that a life built on a solid foundation can be full, not without difficulty, because no life is without difficulty, but with the kind of richness that comes from people who have chosen each other clearly and continue to choose each other every day. Thomas grew into a young man who justified every expectation his 7-year-old self had suggested. By the time he was 14, he was helping Mr. Dahlin teach the younger students at the school, and by 15, he had written to a college in Lawrence asking about their entrance requirements, which arrived back in an envelope with an admissions packet that Thomas carried around for 2 weeks reading sections aloud at the dinner table. Lily grew into a girl who was exactly as she had always promised to be, fierce and sunny and entirely her own person. And she did, in fact, learn to ride very well, which was partly because the Kansas plains were an ideal place to learn to ride, and partly because Jedediah had the horse sense to recognize a natural when he saw one, and had given her the instruction she needed rather than the more limited version that was typically considered appropriate for girls. Henry was a quiet, observant child who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's economy of expression, and who very early developed the habit of watching the world with enormous attention before committing himself to any action, which everyone in the family found both familiar and slightly funny. 2 years after Henry was born, in the summer of 1882, Mary was expecting again. This time the pregnancy was easier and the birth was straightforward, attended by the same doctor who had been present for Henry and who by now had a comfortable familiarity with the Carson household that included knowing which chair to sit in, and that Mrs. Carson would want her coffee while she waited. The second baby was a girl. She arrived in August, in the warmth of a Kansas summer evening, with the windows open and the sound of crickets in the yard, and she was small and dark-haired, and immediately in possession of a stare of such focused intensity that the doctor said he had never seen a newborn look so certain of something. Lily named her. Mary and Jedediah had privately agreed that they would give Lily the naming of this one, given the circumstances of the previous negotiation. Lily, who had by now largely released her attachment to Rose as a name because Henry had occupied the space she had originally designated for a sister, named the baby Clara, after Mrs. Whitmore, the postmaster's wife, who had always given Lily peppermint candies when she came to the post office and who had, Lily explained, very good hair. Clara Whitmore was so pleased by this that she appeared at the house the following morning with a jar of preserves and the kind of emotional gratitude that requires several minutes to fully express, and Mary held Clara the baby, while Clara the woman recovered herself, and Jedediah stood in the doorway of the kitchen drinking his coffee, with the expression of a man who has discovered that his life contains considerably more warmth than he had thought to ask for. Caldwell Creek grew around them through the 1880s. The railroad spur that had been discussed for 3 years finally materialized in 1883, bringing with it the commerce and the chaos and the opportunity that railheads brought to every frontier town. New families arrived. A proper bank opened, replacing the back room of the mercantile where cash had previously been kept in a safe that everyone knew the combination to. A second church was built, Methodist, to complement the existing Baptist congregation, and the two churches maintained a competitive goodwill that improved the quality of both their Sunday services. Jedediah's role evolved as the county evolved. The rougher work of frontier law, the constant threat of violence, the armed confrontations that had characterized the early years, gave way gradually to the more administrative work of a county that had achieved a basic stability. He was appointed county sheriff in 1884, which was a different title than territorial marshal, but a natural progression that the county commissioners had discussed for 2 years before formally offering it to him. He accepted it with the same lack of drama with which he did everything. Mary took over the schoolhouse fully in 1883, when Mr. Dolan moved to a city posting in Topeka. She ran it with the combination of high expectation and genuine warmth that characterized her relationship with everyone. And under her direction, the school expanded from 1 room to 2, and the attendance, which had been irregular in the way of frontier schools where children were often needed at home, became more consistent because she had a gift for making parents understand that educated children were an investment in everyone's future. She also started a lending library in the back room of the schoolhouse. It began with her own books and those she solicited from families who had them, and within 2 years it had grown sufficiently that she applied to the county for a small budget to purchase new volumes, which the county granted because Jedediah Carson was the county sheriff, and he sat on the board and he voted in favor, and nobody was surprised. On a Saturday evening in late October of 1885, 7 years after the night Mary had stood in her cabin doorway and heard a marshal tell her to pack her children and come with him, she was sitting on the front porch of the house on the western edge of Caldwell Creek. The evening was cool and clear, and the sky was performing the particular theatrical excess of color that Kansas sunsets specialize in, orange and pink, and a deep streaking red above the flat line of the horizon. The children, all 4 of them, were inside. Thomas was 17 and rarely in the house on weekend evenings, having discovered the pleasures of the young people's social circle that had developed around the church's Friday socials. But he was home this evening because it was the anniversary of his mother's marriage, and he took dates seriously. Lily was 15 and full of the energy, an opinion that 15 contains. Henry was 5 and Clara was 3, and they had been put to bed an hour ago, and the house was quiet in the particular way it gets when small children are asleep and the larger ones are occupied. Jedediah came out onto the porch with 2 cups of coffee and sat in his chair beside her and handed her a cup without ceremony, which was the companionable ritual of 7 years of evenings. They watched the sky change together. The sun was 3/4 of the way below the horizon, pulling its color with it, and the first stars were appearing in the east. "Do you remember," Mary said, "the first time you came to the cabin?" "Every detail," he said. "You were terrifying," she said, and she heard him make the small sound that was his version of a laugh. "Good," he said. "You needed to move quickly." "I did," she agreed. She cradled her coffee cup. "I thought, when you first came in that way, throwing the door open and telling me what to do, I thought, this is a very presumptuous man." "Also accurate," he said. She smiled. "But then you called the children by their names. You had learned their names before you came to the cabin. You knew Thomas was out back and Lily was in the loft. You had been paying attention." "Yes," he said. "That was when I started to think," she said, "that maybe you were not just presumptuous." He turned to look at her and she turned to look at him. And in the last of the sunset light, he was the same man who had stood in her cabin doorway 7 years ago, weathered and steady and uncompromisingly direct, and also entirely different, softened in the ways that years of love soften people, deepened in the ways that shared life deepens people. And she thought, as she had thought 100 times, that the frontier had given her everything it had first taken away, but with interest. "Mary," he said, "you are the finest thing that ever happened to me." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the stars were coming out one by one above the Kansas plains, and the house behind them was full of sleeping children and the warm smell of coffee, and 7 years of daily choosing each other. "Likewise, Jedediah," she said. "Likewise." Inside the house, Mr. Buttons, who was by now an elderly cat of immense dignity, was asleep at the foot of the bed where he had always slept, and where no one had ever successfully relocated him, dreaming whatever cats dream when they have spent their lives in houses full of children and warmth and good people. Thomas would go to Lawrence for college in the spring and write letters home twice a week that were so detailed and so full of intellectual enthusiasm that his mother read them aloud at the dinner table. Lily would grow into one of the finest writers in the county and would eventually teach writing to half the children in Caldwell Creek, and would also marry a farmer's son at 20 who was steady and kind, and not at all intimidated by her, which was the essential qualification. Henry would grow up to be a doctor, a calling that surprised no one who had paid attention to the way he watched the world. Clara would grow up to be a great deal like her mother, which was a very good thing to grow up to be. In the spring of 1886, a third child of Mary and Jedediah's was born, a boy they named James, who arrived with the same vigorous announcement Henry had made, and who, unlike Henry, appeared to have no intentions of becoming quiet about it for some years to come. He had his father's dark eyes and his mother's copper-brown coloring and Lily's apparently inherited opinion of himself, which was high. James grew up knowing, as all of the Carson children grew up knowing, that their parents had found each other in the middle of something difficult and had chosen each other out of something real, and that the house they lived in and the town around it had been made better by that choice. He grew up knowing that his mother was a woman who did not accept injustice without responding to it, and that his father was a man who showed up when it mattered, which are the two best things a child can learn. Mary Quinn Carson stood on her front porch on a winter morning in December of 1888, exactly 10 years after the night Jedediah had thrown open the door of a different home and ordered her out of it into his protection, and she watched her husband ride out toward the county road on the bay horse's successor, a younger gray animal that Thomas had helped choose the previous spring. The morning was cold and clear, the kind of Kansas winter morning that is purely blue and white and completely without ambiguity. Thomas was in Lawrence. Lily was inside with the younger children, getting James and Clara into their coats for the walk to school. Henry was in the kitchen eating the last of his breakfast with the contemplative focus he brought to everything. Mary watched Jedediah reach the far side of the yard and turn in his saddle to look back at the house, which he always did, and she raised her hand and he raised his, and then he turned the horse toward the road and rode out into the morning. She stood for a moment in the cold air, her breath making small clouds, and felt the full weight of her life, not as burden, but as the thing you feel when you hold something precious and understand its value precisely because you know what it cost. She had packed her children and gone with him. She had trusted a fierce, quiet, honest man in the middle of a dangerous night on the Kansas plains, and the trust had been exactly right, and from that night everything good had followed. She went inside. Henry had finished his breakfast. Lily had James and Clara in their coats. The house was warm and loud and full of the ordinary daily richness of a life built well. Mary Quinn Carson put her shawl on its hook, went to the stove, and put the kettle on for the morning's work. The world was full of everything she needed, and she was not leaving.